Welcome to the Politics of Everything. I'm Amber Daines, your host and podcast producer. This is a half hour of power, a podcast dropping every week where I unpack the politics of everything, from money to motherhood, nutrition to narcissism, startups to secularism, the environment, quality, and much, much more. Our guests are seasoned in the field or topic of their choice, even if you've not heard of them yet. This is a non-partisan show. So while I love exploring varied views and get a buzz from a healthy debate of ideas, this is not a purely blue, white, green program. Please subscribe, tune in and enjoy the politics of everything. With me today is Samantha Dybac, founder and managing director of the PR Hub, host Influence Unlocked podcast. She's also the founder and managing director of the PR Hub, a PR firm and strategic relations agency for entrepreneurs, business leaders, and high-growth disruptive brands. As the host of Influence Unlocked podcast, she has influenced lots of people. She's influenced me to bring her back on the show today because this is not her first podcast or her first rodeo. She's been a guest in the past, and the show itself was ranked by Apple in the top 10 business podcasts in Australia in 2020. Samantha brings over 15 years' experience of working with founders to help them unlock the value behind their personal brand in order to build awareness, credibility, and trust that catapults both them and their companies into the spotlight. She's featured twice as a finalist in the B&T Women in Media Awards, as a finalist in the 2019 Sydney Entrepreneur of the Year, and has successfully completed her AICD course, which is no mean feat, having done that many years ago myself. This is obviously not the first time I've had her on the show, but today we are not talking about PR, but the politics of influence. And I warmly welcome you back into the podcast room, Samantha.
Amber, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm excited.
Absolutely. So look, a few years ago, we had you speaking about the politics of PR, and it was a fantastic episode. But since then, you have become a fellow podcaster and you have your successful and popular show, which I have mentioned. Why was it that angle that really, was the one for you to run a show on? And what have you learned about influence through it?
So, look, I think a good place to start is when I first was considering the possibility of producing a podcast. And the inspiration for that was the people that we were working with every day at the PR Hub, so our clients. We represent entrepreneurs, business leaders, CEOs, people who are doing amazing things with their businesses and in their careers. And often we would be getting requests to put them onto podcasts. And so it sort of dawned on me one day. I thought, hang on a second, we've got all this amazing talent, these great stories to tell. Why don't we start our own? So not knowing the level of work that was required in producing a podcast at that stage, I went, yep, we're going to do it. Let's find out all about it. And aside from that, I was terrified of hosting a podcast, of being on a podcast. So for me, it was also a personal challenge. And I guess in terms of the Influence Unlocked theme, it was very much about going beyond what we see in the media, beyond the press release, beyond the success, to actually understand what it takes to be a person in that position of influence and, the challenges, the highs, the lows, all of that goes into it, because they're fascinating stories and people love to hear that.
Absolutely. So for some people, influence will mean power. Others, it means change. What does influence mean to you personally, and why do you think it matters? Why is it such an important idea or concept?
So in just over a year, it's just been over a year since we launched the podcast, I would say I've interviewed more than 20 people in various fields with influence. So be it business, media, sport, politics, hospitality, all trying to find out, how they've navigated challenges and the responsibilities of having influence, of having a public profile. And for me to get to the bottom of that, I added a question, which is the last question in every show. The question is, what is your one tip for people with influence? And the reason I finished off with that is because there's actually so much to learn from these amazing people about, what they think influence means. Is it power? Is it change? Is it something else? Over time, I've found that for a lot of them, the answers are quite similar, which I think is really interesting. But, influence is a place where you can have great positive change. And you can have power, but how do you wield that power effectively or responsibly? So they're sort of some of the things that they talk about. And I think very much what I've learned from all of these people on the podcast is that, influence, you have a responsibility, to live out your purpose and live out your values and use your influence to influence others in a positive way and a way that, really holds true to what you believe.
That's a really great summary. And I love how that you do put it to other people, because that's what I love about my show. I must admit, I get to ask you these questions, but I also learn so much along the way. And sometimes it feels like I'm getting like a really fabulous business meets psychology, educational experience all in one show. But I know that influential people obviously, can go either way. So, it can be used for good or for evil or something in between. And I sort of used extreme examples of, a humanitarian like a Mother Teresa versus a despot such as a dictator. Where have you seen influence go from one way to another? Have you sort of witnessed that as perhaps someone becomes more famous or, cares a little bit less about the things that made them? Has there been times that you've watched that influence shift, and kind of what's that sort of shown you about the idea of influence?
I wrote an article actually about this topic about a month ago, earlier this year. So it was just after the storming of Capitol Hill in the United States. And, I think a lot of people would be aware of the media that talked about Donald Trump and, what was his impact or, influence on that particular event. And, that to me, and I wrote about this, was a case of somebody with an enormous amount of power. Some would say, the most influential person in the world, wielding their influence irresponsibly. And, then we saw the fallout from that. So I guess that's quite a commonly known example.
That's a good one to refer to. I think a lot of people saw that, and even if you perhaps were, in terms of your political beliefs, more a Trump supporter, it'd be hard to watch that and not feel like that's gone too far.
Yeah, look, I mean, he, obviously he was very prolific on Twitter until he was not able to do that anymore. That was his platform of choice. But I guess that for me personally is an example of somebody who has an enormous amount of influence and power, not using that in the best way. As something closer to home, and again, I mentioned this in the article, was for me, I live in Sydney, in New South Wales, and watching our Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, and how she's managed, I guess, the COVID outbreaks over the Christmas period, but also just from where it started to where it is now. And there's a lot of confusion and fear, particularly in that Christmas period, and the lines of communication were always very consistent and clear and open and to the point. She showed up every day. She delayed her own holidays. Of course, not everybody agreed with exactly everything that she and her government did or how they handled it or what they said. That's the nature of life. But for me, she faced criticism and she didn't respond in a reactive or defensive way. But it came across more as being, and analysing the situation, considering her response. We can see that in general, there is a lot of support for how she's played that out, and also how New South Wales have played out the COVID outbreaks and the management of COVID. So for me, that's a complete opposite of, somebody like Donald Trump and how he operated during his term. So sort of two different, I guess, reasonably well known.
And I love the fact they're both political examples. As someone who loves politics, they're good. And I suppose there's lots of business examples you could possibly draw upon. But I'd really love to ask you, the idea of influence. I mean, these are people that are high profile that you've just mentioned, but is achieving a position of influence something that is just reserved for those few special people that maybe have a great media profile or are positions of power, such as a president or a premier? Or can other people exert influence in their community in other ways and maybe not be known? Or is that impossible? Just influence and impact and profile all go hand in hand?
I truly believe that we all have a responsibility or all have a part to play when it comes to influence. Social media certainly opened that up for everybody in the community. So whereas you could only broadcast on TV, radio, print magazines, whatever the case it was, that was limited to people who had access. Now we have access to social media, and anybody can use social media as a platform to express their opinions and thoughts, which to me is influence. So it's not impossible. It's certainly not reserved to people who get to a certain celebrity status or, position in the community. And I think there's such beauty in that, because as you mentioned, like, great things can happen at a community level or a, not-for-profit or charitable level, where they don't have to be people who we just perceive in the traditional sense as being influencers.
An interesting twist on the word influence is influencers. And I know you and I work in that media branding space. And the term influencer didn't even exist perhaps 10 years ago. There might have been celebrity brand ambassadors or a different name. But what is the role of these influencers in achieving sort of brand influence? So this is more your business head coming into play here. Is it essentially an industry that needs to grow, or can we see brands achieving influence without that kind of micro influencer, micro famous face, or someone that's well known being attached to them, particularly in social media where I guess influencers play the most?
Yeah, so when I get asked this question, I always go back in time to my first job, my first real job while I was at university, and that was with an Aussie hair removal brand called Nads.
Oh, I know that. I think we talked about this last time. They were one of the first people I interviewed as a business journalist when they were starting that business. So there you go. Two worlds collide.
Look, and it really does. I was saying this to somebody over the weekend. You know how your career or how your life somehow has all these connecting dots, and what you might be doing at one stage, and you have no idea why or how that's going to play out later on. But really, my career really has gone full circle. And so the example of Nads is that story was built around a mother's love for her daughter, and the face of that brand was very much the mother who created that brand, Sue Ismail, and her daughter Natalie. And so from very early on in my career, I saw the power of what having a profile or a face, a person behind a brand can do to help it resonate with a larger audience. That's not to say that everybody needs to use influencers, because again, the definition of influence and influence is very broad. And back then, as you said, Amber, nobody was talking about influencers, but it's this word of influence, I guess. And for for the business that I run now, the PR Hub, it is very much about leveraging a founder's or a CEO's or business leader's profile and expertise, and using that as a platform to then showcase the businesses that they're working in. So it's a fascinating space. I think every brand needs a spokesperson, but every brand is different. So I would never say that there's a stock standard response for how or to what level you should be using a person. But I think people buy from people. So if you can have somebody who has a true, authentic, genuine story alongside that particular product or service, I think it's going to resonate with a far greater audience than if you're just trying to sell a product or service on its own.
Absolutely. And I guess the industry was also shifting. I mean, obviously, there's been a few questions about the value of influencers, particularly as budgets have got tighter with lots of companies struggling during the pandemic and so forth, and looking at where they spend their money. And wasn't even aware there was a micro influencer market until recently, when one of my former clients has actually embraced some ambassadors, which are not known to us, but are really key to their audience. So they are athletes that have had some sort of setback or disability impact in their life. And so they're not necessarily household names, and they're not necessarily going to make it to the Olympics, but they've really gone with that. And it's so authentic to their brand that I thought, wow, that's not just clever, but it's actually really authentic. And I think sometimes we're so savvy now that being able to just sort of say, oh, this person's attached to a brand, it doesn't work the same way as it might have in sort of the 80s, 90s and the early millennia period, where you'd have a celebrity who just was being paid to put their face and name to something.
Yeah, I mean, consumers are a lot more savvy these days, and it doesn't have to be, we have learnt that over in recent years, that it doesn't have to be what we call a macro influencer who, is using your product. If it's somebody that actually looks like they love and enjoy the product, and people are going to resonate with that because it's like, oh, they're a bit like me, or, I want to be like that. So yeah, it's a fascinating shift.
Absolutely. So what kinds of influence do you strive to have for your PR clients and also for your team? So I guess it's a two-part question. There's the idea that you represent your clients, as you mentioned, lots of them have influence, and you're trying to put them out there into the media and the other spaces where people are actually understanding who they are, what they stand for, and raising, I guess, their profile as well as helping build their business really. But also with your team, is there a way in which you operate where you use your own influence and your own expertise to really help build that team?
Yeah, I think that word expertise is very much a place where we would start. So everybody is a little bit different, but it's very much about, what is the expertise of that particular client, or, what's my expertise in my team, and building that out. Because again, I think it comes back to those pillars of being genuine and authentic, and people, whether it's journalists or whether it's just the general public, being able to understand what the connection is between that particular spokesperson or influencer or brand ambassador and whatever they're talking about. or selling. And so with our clients, it's very much about looking at the category, the industry that they're in, their experience to date, obviously where they want to take it in terms of their own personal profile, and then deciding what that might look like from an influence perspective. So yeah, it's very much independent to each client, because some clients will want to have more of a presence in the media than others, which is absolutely fine.
Which is interesting when you run a PR firm, isn't it? Because, I think that goes hand in hand, but perhaps it doesn't.
Yeah, look, I mean, I have to say, I never trained in PR and I don't have a background in PR. So the business that I've built, sort of, it's built on what I've learned over the years through marketing and running businesses and sales. And for me, again, coming back to that example of NADS, very much understanding that people do resonate, like they buy from people. People love to hear other people's stories. They love to hear about their expertise or the challenges, or, when things didn't go so well and how they turned it around to get to where they are. So it's very much sort of the business that we've built, and the premise of all the work that we do. But there's always a level of, it doesn't have to be profile. It could be just sometimes somebody's a spokesperson, but making sure that if we're trying to position them as somebody with expertise and with influence, that it's believable and that it's relatable.
Absolutely. And with your team, obviously you've built an amazing business and you've got staff around you. How do you use your influence to maybe mentor them or guide them or even sort of collaborate with them in the business?
So one of the things that I love the most about seeing the business grow is actually that opportunity to mentor and that opportunity to sort of help shape people, not tell them exactly what to do. But, I think about myself going back to when I first started and some of the great mentors that I've had and how much of a difference they made in my career. And to think that now that I can use that position of, being a business owner with a team that's growing and with people who are really, they're great. You can see the potential. And to me, like, that is so exciting to be able to work with some people that have really want to do well in their careers, love what they're doing, and are just looking for some guidance. I mean, it does make me sound a little bit old, but at the same time, that is one of the
wise, I'd say, Samantha. Wise, not old.
It's one of the joys of growing a business. It really is to create a team. And I never realized that that's what I would love about growing a business. But as the team has grown, and we've grown quite a bit in the past 6 months, to see that happening and to be in that position, to me, that it's a position of influence, yes, but it's also a position that carries great responsibility. And again, like I said before, it's how do you wield that position of influence in a responsible and positive way.
So if you could have one song, a book or a screen show, and that could be a film or a series that always makes your heart skip a beat, or first comes to mind. Some people don't like the skip a beat piece because they find that a little bit too heart centric. What would you choose and why? What does that mean to you?
I had 2 songs actually, and I was.
Oh, you can have 2. Go on.
They're very different extremes. So the first one is, and this sounds quite strange, but it's actually the Ukrainian national anthem. So my family are from Ukraine, both sides of my family, and I'm second generation Australian. And if you listen to, it does sound weird, but when it's sung in Ukrainian and you listen to the melody and the lyrics, it's just a tear wells up in my eyes every single time. And, I have been to Ukraine. I haven't lived there, but I've been there a few times, but there's just something about it that evokes like such emotion. And, I think about my grandparents and what they did when they came to Australia. It sounds a bit crazy, but that's definitely the song.
No, it sounds really meaningful and it makes sense. And I have to say, no one has ever given that as an answer, a national anthem. So there you go. There's a first for you.
I thought so. My other one was like complete other end of the spectrum, a dance music song from 10 years ago. So I don't know what that
Are you going
says.
to tell us what it is?
Oh, sure. It's very different to that one. So it's actually a song by the Freemasons and it's called Rain Down Love. So very different.
Excellent.
But yeah, they would be the 2 songs.
Great. So as we wrap up today, what would be your overarching message or messages for anyone who's facing the politics of influence?
So a couple things. The first thing would be to stay strong to your values and hold yourself accountable. So if you're in a position of influence, to think about what does that mean? Who are you influencing? But also what's important to you? And then how do you express it? How do you use that? And hold yourself accountable is, it's something that I think we should do in life. But really, when you're in that position, do you look back and go, well, I use my influence for good? I can stand there and say, what I did was great, and it's affected positive change. I think the other thing is, it's sort of, going back to that example of Gladys Berejiklian, is to show up and to actually be visible. Because if you're in a position of influence and people recognize and expect that from you, then you've got to show up when it's good times, and you've got to show up when it's bad times. And you've got to be, show up and also, make decisions and make considered decisions and analyze the situation, but not shy away from it, because that's the position that you're in.
That's fantastic advice. And look, I don't usually promote other people's podcasts on my podcast, but you have to listen to Influence Unlocked, and I'll have some details of that and how to contact Samantha on my show notes. You have been listening to The Politics of Everything. Until next time, keep well. Thanks so much for listening today. If you've enjoyed The Politics of Everything, I thrive on your feedback. So please add a short review and share the podcast with your network through Apple, Spotify, and all the usual suspects. I'm always on the hunt for new and diverse guests, so if you or someone you know has a fresh idea you're busting to get out there, please email me at amber@amberdanes.com, and my crew will get back to you very soon.